Welcome back to the Alibi Club, where every mystery is a case file waiting to be reopened. Los Angeles, 1947. A city of dazzling lights, swelling orchestras, and the eternal promise of fame. But beneath the glamour of Hollywood's golden age, lurked shadows no spotlight could chase away. On the morning of January 15th, the illusion shattered when the mutilated body of a young woman was discovered in a vacant lot. Her name was Elizabeth Short, but the world would know her only as the Black Dahlia. Her story became Hollywood's darkest secret, a tale of beauty, ambition, brutality, and a mystery that still whispers through Los Angeles more than 70 years later. The Los Angeles of the 1940s was a city wrapped in contradictions. On the surface, it was a paradise of sunshine and opportunity. The war was over, and America was celebrating its victory with a renewed sense of optimism. Soldiers came home, factories boomed, and the nation turned its gaze westward toward California, the land where dreams seemed to grow as naturally as the palm trees that lined Sunset Boulevard. Hollywood was the jewel in this crown, a myth-making machine that churned out fantasies of love, glamour, and eternal youth. On the silver screen, life was glossy and immaculate, and the women who graced it appeared almost untouchable, goddesses in satin gowns with perfect smiles. But behind the neon glow and the red carpets, the city carried a darker pulse. Los Angeles was a patchwork of illusions, stitched together by money, corruption, and longing, while Hollywood Boulevard glistened with marquees, promising the magic of cinema. Just a few blocks away, flopphouses and dingy bars catered to the endless tide of dreamers, who arrived with little more than a suitcase and a head full of ambitions. Some made it, most didn't. For every star whose name glittered in lights, there were thousands who vanished into anonymity. Waitresses, dancers, secretaries, extras who never earned a speaking line. In the 1940s, this underclass of hopefuls lived in a constant state of struggle, chasing auditions by day and scraping together rent money by night. The city itself was in flux. Los Angeles had swelled in population during the war, attracting workers for aircraft factories, shipyards, and defense industries. With them came soldiers, sailors, and restless young men and women in search of excitement. The streets were alive with jazz clubs, late-night diners, and after-hours speakeasies where smoke hung heavy in the air, and the promise of illicit fun drew crowds long after midnight. Yet just as quickly as the city's wealth grew, so too did its shadows. The police force was stretched thin, plagued by corruption and whispers of collusion with organized crime. The papers reported glitzy premieres on one page and grisly crimes on the next. Los Angeles was a city of masks, and it was all too easy for someone to slip between them unnoticed. It was in this fragile balance, between dream and nightmare, that Elizabeth Short arrived. She wasn't the only one. In fact, she was just another face among thousands. But something about Los Angeles in the 1940s made it the perfect stage for her story. The city itself seemed to hunger for legends, whether triumphant or tragic, and the Black Dahlia would become its most haunting. Before her body was discovered, before the papers transformed her into a sensation, Elizabeth Short was just another young woman trying to carve out a place in the city of illusions. For women of her time, Hollywood offered both possibility and peril. The film industry promised independence and recognition in a country still adjusting to shifting gender roles after the war. But with opportunity came exploitation. Casting couches were whispered about openly, and powerful men controlled the destinies of those desperate for a break. Women who came to Hollywood alone were vulnerable, especially those without money or connections. Elizabeth's story could have been the story of any number of hopefuls who passed through Los Angeles, but fate had marked her differently. The mid-1940s also saw the rise of what would later be called film noir. Movies that reflected the darker side of human nature filled theaters, with shadows slicing across rain-slick streets, detectives chasing ghosts, and femmes fatales leading men to ruin. These stories spoke to something real in the city, a recognition that beneath the sunshine was rot, corruption, violence, desperation. They weren't just plot devices for the screen, they were the invisible currents of Los Angeles itself, and when the Black Dahlia murder erupted into public consciousness, it was as though the city's own noir script had bled into reality. By the time Elizabeth Short stepped into this world, Los Angeles was already teetering between its glittering facade and its festering underbelly. The crime that would make her infamous didn't just horrify the public, it crystallized the sense that Hollywood's dream factory was built on unstable ground. For the people who lived there, her death was a grotesque reminder that the city's promises came at a terrible price. For the rest of the world, It confirmed every suspicion that beneath Hollywood's golden glow lay a darkness as deep as any shadow cast on screen. Elizabeth's murder would become a cultural marker, but it also exposed something essential about Los Angeles itself, its ability to consume people, to chew them up and spit them out, whether through failure, exploitation, or in her case, brutal violence. The city thrived on reinvention, but in doing so, it left countless casualties in its wake. Most disappeared quietly, their stories forgotten. Elizabeth Short's tragedy ensured hers would never be. In the months and years after her death, people would argue endlessly about who killed her, why she was targeted, and what her life had really been like. But those questions all came later. In January of 1947, she was still just another face in the crowd, another young woman carried along by the currents of Los Angeles, her name not yet transformed into a legend. What makes her story different is what happened next. The morning her body was found in a vacant lot in Leimert Park, that discovery would rip through the illusion of Hollywood's golden glow, leaving scars that never healed. The truth is that Los Angeles was always a city of extremes, light and darkness, wealth and poverty, glamour and ruin. It was a place where anyone could become someone, and where someone could vanish without a trace. In Elizabeth Short's story, those extremes collided in the most violent way possible. She came seeking opportunity, and instead became the symbol of Hollywood's darkest secret. Her life was eclipsed by her death, and her death became a mirror for the city itself. Beautiful, terrible, unforgettable. And so the stage was set. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a murder, it was the city revealing its truest self. Before she was a headline, before she was reduced to the name Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short was simply a young woman with fragile dreams. To the tabloids, she was a mystery draped in noir shadows, a woman who seemed almost born to die tragically. But behind the myth, there was a daughter, a sister, and a restless soul trying to find her place in a world that didn't always leave much room for women like her. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29, 1924, in the working-class town of Hyde Park, Massachusetts. She was the third of 5 daughters, raised in a household that knew more hardship than luxury. Her father, Cleo Short, built miniature golf courses during the boom of the 1920s, but when the Depression struck, the business collapsed. One day in 1930, when Elizabeth was still a child, Cleo vanished. His car was found abandoned near a bridge, and the family believed he had taken his own life. For years, Phoebe, Elizabeth's mother, struggled alone to raise her 5 daughters, sewing clothes, taking odd jobs, and depending at times on charity. The weight of absence shaped Elizabeth's childhood. She grew up surrounded by women, always yearning for something missing. Years later, Elizabeth would learn that her father hadn't died at all. He had simply left. He wrote to her mother out of the blue, confessing that he had started a new life in California. The revelation carried a bitterness that Elizabeth never entirely shook. Perhaps it planted the first seed of her fascination with escape, with reinvention, with California itself, that faraway land where her father had disappeared. Elizabeth grew into a striking young woman, slender, pale-skinned, with dark hair and eyes that seemed almost too large for her face. She suffered from chronic bronchitis and asthma, which led doctors to recommend she spend winters in warmer climates. She often traveled south to Florida, staying with family friends, basking in the sun, and cultivating the style that would later define her: glamorous clothes, red lipstick, and a mysterious air. From her teenage years, she carried herself like someone destined for a bigger stage than her small-town upbringing could provide. Like many young women of her generation, Elizabeth was captivated by Hollywood. Movies were not just entertainment, they were promises of transformation. Stars like Rita Hayworth and Veronica Lake reinvented themselves entirely, adopting new names, new identities, and new lives. Why couldn't she? Elizabeth believed beauty might be her passport to a better future, and she embraced the role of dreamer wholeheartedly. Those who knew her described her as friendly but restless, someone who longed for more than ordinary life could provide. By the early 1940s, Elizabeth began drifting across the country, chasing opportunity. She lived in Massachusetts, Florida, and at times with her estranged father in California, though their relationship remained strained. She worked as a waitress, modeled occasionally, and mingled with servicemen stationed at various military bases during World War II. She loved the company of men in uniform, not out of vanity, but because it made her feel close to the action, to adventure, to possibility. She dated soldiers, even claimed she was engaged to one who later died in combat. Whether that engagement was real, or a story she told to give her life shape. No one knows for sure, but it fits the pattern of Elizabeth Short's life, a mixture of fact and myth, reality and performance. Friends often described her as sweet, polite, and a little naive, but she also had an aura of mystery. She dressed elegantly, even when she couldn't afford much, and she was known for dyeing her shoes black with mascara when money was short. She cultivated an image, one that made her stand out in crowded rooms. People noticed her, and that attention seemed to fuel her, even as it sometimes placed her in dangerous company. By the mid-1940s, Elizabeth had fully embraced California as her future. She dreamed of becoming an actress, though she never landed a role beyond background work. Without connections, she was left to navigate the treacherous social circles of Los Angeles, where predators lurked behind every smile. She moved often, living with friends, boyfriends and acquaintances. Sometimes she overstayed her welcome. Sometimes she charmed her way into new arrangements. She never had stability, and she was often broke, yet she never stopped presenting herself as though she belonged in the spotlight. The press, in the aftermath of her death, painted her as a wayward figure, a woman of questionable morals, a drifter, even a temptress. But the truth was far more complicated. Elizabeth Short was vulnerable, caught between her ambitions and the harsh realities of Los Angeles. She longed for stardom, but lacked the safety net or resources to protect herself. She wanted love, but often placed her trust in men who could not or would not care for her. She wasn't a femme fatale, as late noir depictions made her seem. She was instead a young woman out of her depth in a city that consumed dreamers whole. What makes Elizabeth Short so haunting, even today, is that her life feels unfinished. She was only 22 years old when she died, still suspended between possibility and reality. She hadn't yet succeeded, but she hadn't yet failed either. Her story was still in motion, which is perhaps why her death struck such a chord. The murder froze her in time, forever young, forever mysterious, forever the girl who might have been. When newspapers dubbed her the Black Dahlia, the nickname stuck not because it described who she was, but because it transformed her into something more marketable. An icon, a mystery, a symbol. The nickname echoed The Blue Dahlia, a noir film that had just been released the previous year, starring Veronica Lake. The association was irresistible to reporters. It tied Elizabeth directly to the cinematic world she had so desperately wanted to enter. Overnight, she became a character in a story far larger than herself. But behind the myth and the lurid headlines, Elizabeth Short was still that girl from Massachusetts, still the daughter who grew up without a father, still the young woman painting her shoes with mascara because she couldn't afford new ones, still the dreamer who believed Hollywood might let her step into the light. And that is what makes her tragedy so devastating. She was human, ordinary in her struggles, extraordinary in her persistence. She wasn't the Black Dahlia when she lived. She was Elizabeth Short. It was only in death that the world turned her into a legend. By January of 1947, Elizabeth Short's life had narrowed into a fragile routine of survival. She had spent years drifting through Los Angeles and other cities, chasing connections, hoping for opportunity, and often ending up with little more than empty promises. Her dream of Hollywood stardom had not materialized, but she continued to carry herself as though the possibility was always just around the corner. It was this mixture of resilience and desperation that defined her final days. She was 22 years old, too young to have known much stability, old enough to understand how precarious her situation had become. In the weeks before her death, Elizabeth lived much like she always had, borrowing couches, staying in hotels she couldn't afford, leaning on acquaintances who offered her temporary shelter. Friends and acquaintances later recalled that she often seemed restless, moving from place to place without a clear plan. At times she charmed those around her with her politeness and striking looks, but she was also known for being evasive, withholding details about her personal life, or spinning stories that didn't quite add up. Whether this was a defense mechanism, or simply a way of keeping the dream alive, no one could say for certain. Her last known residence before her disappearance was the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. On the evening of January 9, 1947, Elizabeth was dropped off there by Robert Red Manley, a married salesman who had known her casually. Manley told police that he had met her in San Diego days earlier, and that she had asked him for a ride back to Los Angeles. He insisted that their relationship was platonic, though investigators would later scrutinize his every word. Manley recalled that Elizabeth had asked to be dropped at the Biltmore, where she said she was meeting her sister. Hotel staff would later testify that they saw her using the lobby phone, and then simply vanishing into the night. No confirmed sighting places her after that evening. This moment, her standing in the ornate lobby of the Biltmore Hotel, dressed in black, clutching her belongings, is the last verified image the world has of Elizabeth Short alive. In the days that followed, she seemed to disappear into the shadows of Los Angeles. Rumors abounded about where she went, whom she saw, and what she might have been doing. Some claimed she was seen in bars along Hollywood Boulevard. Others said she was spotted with servicemen at nightclubs, and still others suggested she spent time with acquaintances of questionable reputation. Police investigated dozens of leads, but none could confirm her exact whereabouts between January 9th and the morning of January 15th, when her body was discovered. This gap, 6 days unaccounted for, has haunted the case ever since. What happened to Elizabeth Short in that lost time? Did she fall into the company of someone she trusted? Was she held against her will? Was she killed elsewhere, and her body staged in Leimert Park? Each possibility adds to the enduring mystery. Those who knew her in life described Elizabeth as both approachable and elusive. She cultivated friendships, but she also kept people at arm's length. She was known to socialize with men, but according to many friends, she often resisted physical intimacy. Some later speculated that this created tension with the men she spent time with, men who thought their attention or money entitled them to something more. This aspect of her life has led some researchers to believe that her final days may have been marked by conflict, by encounters with men who didn't accept rejection easily. It's also worth remembering that Elizabeth lived in a city where the line between glamour and danger was razor thin. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a place of transience. Soldiers passing through, hustlers preying on the hopeful, powerful men, manipulating the vulnerable. A young woman without family or financial support was exposed to dangers most people couldn't imagine. Elizabeth navigated this world, the only way she knew how, with charm, with caution, with the hope that tomorrow might finally be different. Her last days might have seemed ordinary to those around her. She checked into hotels, met acquaintances, lingered in lobbies, but beneath the surface, something darker was moving toward her. Whether it was a chance encounter, or the culmination of a longer pattern, the tragedy that awaited her was already set in motion. The myth of the Black Dahlia often makes it seem as though Elizabeth's fate was inevitable, as if her life were a noir script leading inexorably to its brutal climax. But the truth is that her final days were marked by small, everyday moments that could have belonged to anyone. She wanted to call her sister. She wanted to find a place to stay. She wanted, perhaps more than anything, to keep believing that her life still held possibility. But by January 15th, the possibility was gone. That morning, a mother walking with her child in the quiet neighborhood of Leimert Park stumbled upon something so grotesque it would scar the city forever. The vacant lot, the stark body, the violence so shocking it defied comprehension. It all began with those lost days, the ones where Elizabeth Short slipped from the public eye and into the darkest chapter of Hollywood's history. Her last known sighting at the Biltmore Hotel was not just the final moment of her life in public view. It was the final moment before Elizabeth Short became the Black Dahlia. The morning was quiet, unremarkable. Los Angeles had just shaken off the fog of another winter night. In the neighborhood of Leimert Park, a relatively new suburban development south of downtown, families were beginning their day like any other. Children prepared for school, shopkeepers set up for business, and housewives planned their errands. It was a corner of the city that prided itself on order and stability, far from the neon excess of Hollywood Boulevard. But by the end of that morning, Leimert Park would become infamous, forever tied to one of the most shocking crimes in American history. Around 10 a.m., a young mother named Betty Bersinger was pushing her baby stroller along South Norton Avenue. She had decided to cut across a vacant lot on her way to a shoe repair shop. At first glance, she thought she saw a discarded mannequin lying on the grass. The pale skin, the segmented appearance. It looked too artificial to be real. But as she moved closer, a cold realization struck. What she was looking at wasn't a mannequin. It was the body of a young woman, mutilated and staged with a precision that made the sight even more horrifying. Elizabeth Short lay severed into two halves, her torso and legs placed neatly in the open lot, her body drained of blood, her skin pale as marble. The brutality was undeniable, but so was the unnatural composure of the scene. The body had been washed, scrubbed clean of blood, as though the killer had carefully prepared her for display. The cut that separated her body was surgical, almost clinical, leading investigators later to suspect the hand of someone with medical training. Her arms were raised above her head in a grotesque pose, her mouth cut into a chilling smile, carved from ear to ear. Bersinger screamed. She grabbed her child and ran, alerting a nearby neighbor to call the police. Within minutes, patrol cars swarmed the neighborhood. What they found was unlike anything most of them had ever seen. Even hardened detectives were shaken. The body seemed less like the aftermath of a killing, and more like a message, a statement left deliberately for the world to find. Word traveled quickly. By the time detectives cordoned off the lot, reporters were already arriving, tipped off by the fast-moving grapevine of Los Angeles crime news. Photographers rushed to the scene, eager to capture what they thought would be a standard murder investigation. But as details emerged, it became clear that this was no ordinary crime. The scene had the aura of something theatrical, as if staged for maximum shock value. Elizabeth Short's belongings were nowhere to be found. No purse, no identification, no trace of who she had been. At first she was a Jane Doe, another anonymous victim in a city that had seen its share of violence. But this victim was different. The nature of the mutilation, the surgical precision, and the eerie presentation hinted at a killer who wasn't just trying to get rid of a body. Whoever had done this wanted attention. The press fed on every scrap of detail the police released. And even those they didn't. Reporters speculated wildly, embellishing facts, spinning narratives before the investigation had barely begun. This frenzy would define the case in the weeks to come. But in that moment, January 15th, 1947, the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body was first and foremost a human tragedy. A young woman's life had ended in violence so brutal that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend it. The initial investigation of the scene revealed chilling details. The cut that severed Elizabeth's body was identified as a hemicorporectomy, a procedure known in surgical circles but rarely performed outside hospitals. The body had been exsanguinated, drained of blood, giving her skin a waxy pallor. Bruising on her wrists, ankles and thighs suggested she had been bound before her death. The mutilations to her face, the Glasgow smile, as it would later be called, were inflicted post-mortem, evidence that the killer had not only wanted to kill her, but also to transform her into something grotesque. Police canvassed the area, questioning residents, searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. But no one reported anything. Whoever had placed her body there had done so under cover of night, in a neighborhood where people went to bed early and stayed indoors. The body had been displayed with care, positioned so that it would be found in daylight. The killer had chosen visibility over secrecy, daring the world to look upon his work. By midday, the crime scene had become a circus. Reporters trampled the lot, neighbors gathered in clusters, and curious onlookers whispered theories to each other. Detectives tried to maintain control, but the spectacle had already begun. Elizabeth Short's murder wasn't just another case. It was a story, one that was already beginning to slip out of police hands and into the theater of public imagination. The coroner's office soon arrived to transport the body, and it was then that detectives realized how difficult the case would be. With no clear evidence, no immediate witnesses, and no personal effects, the investigation started with nothing but a mutilated corpse and a city hungry for answers. Back at the police station, fingerprint analysis would eventually reveal her identity. Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, Massachusetts native, last seen at the Biltmore Hotel just 6 days earlier. The moment her name was confirmed, the story gained a face. But it wasn't Elizabeth Short that the world would remember. It was the nickname the press would soon give her, the Black Dahlia. That morning in Leimert Park, a mother and child stumbled upon a body. By evening, Los Angeles had stumbled into a nightmare that would never end. From the moment Elizabeth Short's body was discovered, it was clear this was no ordinary murder. Los Angeles had seen violence before. Gangland hits, domestic tragedies, crimes of passion that filled the blotter in endless columns. But this was different. The precision, the staging, the sheer brutality of the Black Dahlia case elevated it beyond simple crime and into something that felt almost ritualistic. It wasn't just a killing, it was a spectacle. The detectives who arrived at the scene tried to maintain composure, but privately, many admitted it was the most gruesome sight of their careers. The way the body had been cut in two, with surgical accuracy, was unlike anything the average homicide officer was trained to handle. It looked less like a murder scene, and more like an operating table gone mad. The absence of blood at the site suggested she had been killed elsewhere, her body meticulously drained before being transported. Then there were the cuts, deep slashes on her thighs and breasts, pieces of flesh carved away, her face mutilated into a grotesque grin. Each detail whispered of cruelty and control, of someone who not only killed but reveled in shaping their victim into something unrecognizable. The autopsy, performed the following day, revealed even more horrifying details. Elizabeth had endured torture before her death. Ligature marks around her wrists and ankles showed she had been tied down. Rope burns suggested prolonged restraint. Her body bore evidence of blunt force trauma to the head, one of the likely causes of death, though strangulation and loss of blood were also considered. The cuts that severed her body had been made with professional precision, through the space between vertebrae, a procedure that even in a medical setting required training and skill. This one fact would fuel decades of speculation. Was her killer a surgeon, a butcher, someone with the knowledge to dismember without hesitation? The police, under pressure from the public and the press, scrambled to find answers. The city demanded them. Newspapers ran lurid headlines in bold type, accompanied by grisly descriptions that blurred the line between reporting and exploitation. Photographs of Elizabeth, taken in life, circulated on front pages nationwide, but they weren't her family snapshots. Instead, the press chose glamour shots, studio-style portraits where she appeared made up, mysterious, alluring. In death, she had been transformed into a myth, a femme fatale of Hollywood noir, even though the real Elizabeth Short had been far from it. The crime scene itself became a symbol. Reporters described the vacant lot on Norton Avenue with morbid fascination. They wrote about how her pale skin contrasted with the dark grass, how her body seemed arranged almost artfully, how the mutilation suggested not random violence but purpose. The public devoured every detail, even as detectives struggled to separate fact from rumor. One paper claimed cryptically that she had been drained like a doll. Another speculated that the killer had medical instruments, even a private space in which to carry out the procedure. Within days, what had been an anonymous body in a field became one of the most sensational murder cases in American history. But with sensation came complication. The sheer attention on the Black Dahlia case meant that evidence was contaminated almost from the start. Reporters had swarmed the scene before it was fully secured, trampling the ground, moving around freely, even taking their own photographs. Neighbors curious about the spectacle wandered close enough to leave behind footprints and cigarette butts. Detectives later admitted that the crime scene had been compromised in ways that made their job far harder than it should have been. Despite this, investigators clung to the details they could confirm. They knew Elizabeth had been killed elsewhere, possibly in a private residence, then transported during the night. They knew her body had been carefully scrubbed clean, perhaps to remove fingerprints or other trace evidence. They knew her face had been mutilated after death, suggesting the killer wanted to send a message, but what that message was, and to whom, remained unclear. For the public, these grisly revelations only deepened the fascination. Radio shows recounted the details breathlessly, framing Elizabeth as a mysterious beauty whose allure had led her into danger. Gossip columns speculated about her connections, real or imagined, to Hollywood figures, criminals, or shadowy lovers. In a city addicted to fantasy, the line between fact and invention dissolved almost immediately. Elizabeth Short, the struggling actress who painted her shoes with mascara, was erased. In her place was the Black Dahlia, a woman cast in the public imagination as dangerous, seductive, and ultimately doomed. The LAPD, desperate to keep control of the narrative, began releasing selective details to the press. They hoped public cooperation might generate leads. Instead, it generated a tidal wave of false confessions and wild theories. Within a week of the murder, dozens of men had walked into police stations claiming responsibility, some out of guilt for unrelated crimes, others simply craving attention. By the end of the year, more than 50 confessions would be logged, none credible. Still, the brutality of the crime and the way it was displayed suggested something beyond chance. Investigators began to consider whether Elizabeth's killer was taunting them, whether the act of bisecting her body and displaying it in a vacant lot was meant as a challenge to authority. Some even suspected multiple killers, given the complexity of the crime, but no theory could be proven. For ordinary Angelenos, the case broke something in their sense of security. It wasn't just the murder, it was the way it had been presented, almost theatrically. People began to whisper that Los Angeles had become a city where no one was safe, where dreams curdled into nightmares. Parents warned their daughters, landlords grew suspicious of tenants, and the idea of a sadistic killer lurking in the city's shadows became an urban legend overnight. In the end, the crime scene of January 15, 1947, wasn't just the site of Elizabeth Short's death, it was the birthplace of an American myth. A murder that shocked, not because of its body count, There was only one victim, but because of its presentation, the killer had forced the world to look, and once it did, it could never look away. The Black Dahlia had arrived. From the moment Elizabeth Short's identity was confirmed, the LAPD found itself under unbearable pressure. The newspapers had already christened her the Black Dahlia, and the public demanded swift justice. The crime's theatrical nature, the surgical dismemberment, the body's deliberate display, had gripped the city in fear and fascination. For the Los Angeles Police Department, still recovering from years of corruption scandals, the case was more than a murder investigation. It was a test of legitimacy. Could they solve the crime that had horrified the nation, or would Los Angeles forever be branded a city where killers walked free? Detectives knew from the start that they were chasing a phantom. There were no fingerprints at the scene, no witnesses, no murder weapon. The killer had left them nothing except the mutilated body itself, and even that was scrubbed clean. Still, they pressed forward, dividing leads among different teams, chasing down names and dragging suspects into the station one after another. At its peak, the Black Dahlia investigation involved more than 50 full-time detectives, an unprecedented mobilization for a single case. The first major lead was Robert "Red" Manley, the last known person to see Elizabeth alive. Manley was a traveling salesman with a wife and child at home, a man whose brief acquaintance with Elizabeth had already raised eyebrows. He admitted driving her from San Diego to Los Angeles and dropping her at the Biltmore Hotel on January 9th. Police detained him, interrogated him for days, and subjected him to 2 polygraph tests. Manley cooperated fully, even volunteering blood samples to rule himself out. In the end, the evidence cleared him. He became the first of many suspects eliminated, but not before his name was splashed across headlines, his life permanently marked by his fleeting association with Elizabeth Short. From there, the investigation sprawled into chaos. Detectives questioned hundreds of people, friends, acquaintances, former boyfriends, strangers who claimed to know her. Nightclubs, bars, and hotels across Los Angeles were raided for leads. Every man Elizabeth had ever been seen with became a potential suspect. The list grew so long it soon became unmanageable. By spring, the LAPD had interviewed more than 150 suspects, and the number would eventually climb to over 200. The scale of the investigation, instead of clarifying the case, only muddied it further. Among the many names, some stood out. Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub and theater owner, was one of them. Elizabeth had stayed at his home briefly, and according to friends, he had offered her work as a dancer. Hansen admitted knowing her, but denied any involvement in her death. Detectives pressed him hard, noting that one of Elizabeth's belongings, an address book, was found with his name embossed on the cover. Still, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Then there was Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and aspiring writer who corresponded with police about the case in unsettling detail. He claimed to have insights into the murder, speaking of surgical cuts and sadistic motives that few outside the investigation could know. His fascination made detectives suspicious, and some were convinced he was the killer. Yet Dillon's confessions shifted and cracked under scrutiny, leading many to dismiss him as just another opportunist drawn to the spotlight of America's most famous murder. But the suspect who continues to cast the longest shadow is Dr. George Hodel, a wealthy physician with a history of abuse and a fascination with the macabre. Hodel was not seriously considered in 1947, but decades later, his own son, a former LAPD detective, would accuse him of the crime. The medical precision of the cuts, Hodel's known sadism, and his connections to Los Angeles' elite have made him one of the most compelling suspects in hindsight. Yet, at the time, police lacked evidence to pursue him, and he remained untouched. The difficulty of the investigation was compounded by the circus atmosphere surrounding it. The press camped outside police headquarters, demanding updates daily. Headlines blared with speculation, naming suspects before they were cleared, weaving narratives out of rumors. Every scrap of gossip became front-page news. The LAPD, desperate to appease the public, sometimes fed the frenzy by releasing details prematurely. Other times, they withheld information, in hopes of trapping the killer into a confession. The strategy backfired. Instead of clarity, the investigation devolved into a spectacle. One of the strangest developments was the flood of confessions. Men and women from across the country wrote letters to the police, claiming responsibility for Elizabeth Short's death. Some walked into precincts and announced their guilt. Others called newspapers directly, hoping to make headlines. Most were easily disproven, but each one drained resources and distracted detectives. By year's end, police had logged more than 50 false confessions, and the total would eventually rise to hundreds. As the weeks stretched into months, frustration mounted. The initial intensity of the investigation began to wane as other crimes demanded attention, leads dried up, suspects were cleared, and the trail grew cold. Within a year, the Black Dahlia murder had become less a police case than a cultural phenomenon, a story people told in whispers, a symbol of Los Angeles' darkest underbelly. But for detectives in 1947, the failure was personal. They had thrown everything at the case, and still, the killer walked free. The LAPD was left with little more than rumors, contradictions, and the haunting image of a young woman's body, carved and posed like a message no one could decipher. The circus of suspects, the endless parade of names and faces, had led nowhere, and yet, in the years that followed, those names would echo endlessly in books, documentaries and theories. The truth may have slipped through the cracks of the investigation, but the legend only grew stronger. The murder of Elizabeth Short was no longer just a crime to be solved. It had become Hollywood's darkest mystery, one that would define the city's identity as much as its films and its stars. If the Black Dahlia murder revealed the brutality lurking beneath Los Angeles' glittering surface, it also exposed another power shaping the city's reality, the press. In 1947, newspapers weren't just observers of crime, they were participants, shapers of public opinion, and in some cases manipulators of fact. Elizabeth Short's murder arrived at the perfect storm of sensational journalism, when circulation wars between papers turned tragedy into front-page theater. The Los Angeles Examiner was first to seize the story, and it did so with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned reporters. Before Elizabeth Short's mother Phoebe even knew her daughter was dead, Examiner reporters contacted her in Massachusetts under false pretenses. They told her Elizabeth had won a beauty contest in Los Angeles, and began asking questions about her life. Only after extracting every detail they could, her background, her dreams, her movements, did they reveal the truth. Her daughter had been murdered. It was a cruel tactic, but in the brutal competition for scoops, compassion came second to copy. From that moment, the Examiner and rival papers transformed Elizabeth Short into something larger than life. They latched onto her beauty, her ambition, her mysterious habits, and wove them into a narrative of danger and allure. The nickname Black Dahlia appeared almost immediately, lifted from the noir film The Blue Dahlia that had played in theaters just the year before. The name stuck because it was irresistible, cinematic, poetic, dripping with menace. Elizabeth Short was no longer just a murder victim, she was a character in Hollywood's darkest script. The press coverage was relentless. Papers printed glamorous photos of Elizabeth, framing her as a mysterious femme fatale even though she had never achieved the stardom she longed for. Reporters leaned into speculation, suggesting she lived a double life, that she was promiscuous, that she frequented nightclubs filled with dangerous men. In truth, Elizabeth's life was far more mundane. She was a young woman scraping by, moving from couch to couch, looking for work. But nuance didn't sell papers, mystery did. Day after day, headlines screamed lurid details. Body bisected, mutilated in fiendish killing, beautiful girl slain in Hollywood horror. Police hunt sex maniac in Dahlia case. The language was designed to inflame, to shock, to make readers feel they were living in a noir thriller, rather than an ordinary city. Circulation soared. For Los Angeles newspapers, the Black Dahlia murder wasn't just news, it was profit. But the sensationalism came at a cost. The flood of publicity warped the investigation, pushing police into a defensive stance as they tried to keep pace with headlines. Reporters often knew details before detectives did, sometimes because officers leaked information, sometimes because journalists invented it outright. The lines between fact and fiction blurred, and the public was left to sort through a haze of rumor and innuendo. The Examiner went further than most. It published letters purportedly from the killer, sent in cut-and-paste style from magazine clippings. One note arrived with a package containing Elizabeth's personal belongings, her birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book. The items had been scrubbed clean with gasoline, erasing fingerprints, taunting police with the killer's cunning. The press ran the story instantly, branding the killer as someone who enjoyed the spotlight as much as the journalists who covered him. This interplay between murderer, police, and media created a feedback loop that turned the case into spectacle. The public followed the story obsessively, poring over every photograph and column. Amateur sleuths wrote in with theories. Ordinary Angelenos whispered about suspects, wondering if their neighbor, their doctor, or the man at the corner store might be the fiend. Hollywood itself seemed implicated. as though the city that manufactured fantasy had finally birthed a nightmare too grotesque to ignore. Elizabeth Short's reputation suffered most of all. The press painted her as a mysterious seductress, a drifter who lured men into danger. Some stories implied she was involved in prostitution or criminal circles. Others cast her as a naive girl undone by her own beauty. None of it captured the truth of her struggles, her poverty, or her longing for stability. Instead, the Black Dahlia became a canvas onto which Los Angeles projected its fears, its fantasies, and its appetite for scandal. It's easy to forget now, but in 1947, women were often judged more harshly in death than men were in life. The Examiner and other papers implied Elizabeth's murder was in part her own fault, that her lifestyle, her relationships, her very independence had invited danger. In this way, the press not only obscured her humanity, but also reinforced a narrative of victim blaming that lingers in discussions of the case even today. For weeks, the Black Dahlia dominated headlines. Other crimes, even other murders, were pushed aside. Reporters jostled for exclusives, sometimes fabricating leads to stay ahead of rivals. The Examiner published speculation about police incompetence, forcing the LAPD into public statements they weren't ready to make. The case became less about Elizabeth Short, and more about the performance of solving her murder. Each side, police, press, public, fed the other in a frenzy that made truth nearly impossible to find. In the end, the press shaped the Black Dahlia more than anyone else. They gave her the name, they fed the legend, they cast her as a tragic heroine of Hollywood noir. Without the Examiner and its rivals, Elizabeth Short might have been remembered as just another unsolved murder victim. Instead, she became immortal, not because of who she was, but because of how the press told her story. The irony is cruel. Elizabeth dreamed of fame, of having her name in lights. In death, the press granted her that, but at a cost she never could have imagined. She became famous, not for her talent, but for her mutilation. Her face graced the front page, not as a rising star, but as Hollywood's darkest secret. If the Black Dahlia case seemed unsolvable, it was not for lack of attention. In the weeks and years after Elizabeth Short's murder, theories multiplied like wildfire. Detectives, reporters, amateur sleuths, and ordinary citizens all became entangled in the puzzle. Some were convinced the killer was a medical professional. Others swore it was a jealous lover, a mobster, or even a Hollywood insider. The more time passed, the more the case slipped from fact into mythology, becoming less an investigation and more an obsession. One of the earliest and most enduring theories was that the killer had medical training. The hemicorporectomy that divided Elizabeth's body was too precise, too clean to be the work of an amateur. Surgeons who reviewed the autopsy reports agreed it required professional knowledge. This pointed investigators toward doctors, medical students, and anyone with access to surgical tools. For a time, police combed through records at hospitals, checking absences and suspicious behavior, but the trail yielded nothing conclusive. The theory, however, stuck. To this day, many believe Elizabeth's killer was someone with scalpel skills. Others argued the murder was personal, driven by rage or rejection. Elizabeth was known to attract attention from men, but she was equally known for refusing advances. Friends testified that she often enjoyed companionship without intimacy, a habit that frustrated some suitors. Did one of them snap? Was her death the violent result of male entitlement turned deadly? This theory fit with the brutality of her wounds, but left unanswered the surgical precision and calculated staging of the body. The mob connection also gained traction. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city where organized crime thrived in nightclubs, gambling rings, and black markets. Some speculated Elizabeth had fallen into the orbit of dangerous men, perhaps unknowingly. Her brief stays with nightclub owner Mark Hansen fueled whispers of underworld ties. Could her murder have been a warning, a message carved into flesh, or was it the work of a sadist using the mob rumor as convenient cover? Then there was Hollywood itself. Elizabeth longed for stardom, but the entertainment industry was riddled with predators. Rumors swirled that she had crossed paths with a powerful producer or director, someone with both motive and means to silence her. The city loved this theory. It fit neatly into the noir narrative, a starlet destroyed by the very machine she worshipped. But again, no evidence tied her to such figures. Hollywood's involvement remained a tantalizing myth, never substantiated. What the theories had in common was their inability to prove anything. The lack of concrete evidence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, obsession grew. The press kept the fire alive, running endless stories about potential suspects and strange leads. Ordinary citizens added fuel by writing letters to police and newspapers, each convinced they had solved the case. For some, the Black Dahlia became a riddle they couldn't let go of. And then there were the confessions, dozens of them. Men and women walked into precincts, claiming to be the killer. Letters arrived in newsrooms, some mocking, others begging for absolution. A few confessions were elaborate, filled with details that initially convinced detectives, until inconsistencies unraveled them. Others were laughably vague, obvious attempts to gain attention. In the end, none held up. Yet each confession, no matter how flimsy, added another layer of spectacle to the case. The strangest part was how the killer seemed to play along. Shortly after the murder, a package was mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner. Inside were Elizabeth's personal belongings, her birth certificate, social security card, photographs, and an address book. The envelope had been carefully scrubbed with gasoline to remove fingerprints. A note inside declared, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." Detectives believed it was authentic, a deliberate taunt from the killer himself. Yet even with this chilling clue, the trail went cold. Over the years, individual suspects gained notoriety. Leslie Dillon, the bellhop and aspiring writer, fascinated police because he seemed to know too much. George Hodel, the wealthy physician, loomed as a suspect decades later when his own son, a retired detective, publicly accused him. Walter Bailey, a surgeon who lived near the crime scene, was considered by some researchers to fit the profile. Each theory had merit, but none could be proved beyond doubt. The obsession outlived the investigation. In the decades that followed, the Black Dahlia became a cultural touchstone. Novelists wove her story into fiction. Filmmakers borrowed her image for noir-inspired thrillers. True crime writers devoted entire careers to unraveling the mystery. Amateur sleuths pored over police files, convinced they could see what others had missed. Theories multiplied: a cult killing, a sadistic experiment, a crime linked to other unsolved murders. The truth, meanwhile, slipped further away. What made the case so enduring wasn't just its brutality, it was the vacuum it left behind. Elizabeth Short's murder was staged to shock, and it succeeded. But the lack of closure, no arrest, no conviction, no definitive explanation, allowed the crime to metastasize into legend. Each new theory, each confession, each obsessive retelling kept the case alive. The Black Dahlia wasn't just a victim anymore. She was an idea, a mirror, onto which people projected their darkest fears and fantasies. For some, the case symbolized male violence against women, a chilling reminder of how vulnerable Elizabeth had been in a city that preyed on the hopeful. For others, it was a conspiracy, proof of police corruption and cover-ups in Los Angeles. For still others, it was an artistic puzzle, a real-life noir narrative begging for interpretation. Theories became less about finding the truth, and more about what the truth said about the city itself. In the end, the theories, obsessions, and confessions all led to the same haunting conclusion. No one really knew who killed Elizabeth Short. What the world did know, and could never forget, was how she died, and how her death transformed her into the most famous unsolved murder victim in American history. Time has a strange way of transforming tragedy. For most murder cases, the horror fades with the years. Names slip from headlines, victims are remembered only by family, and killers, caught or not, are eventually forgotten. But the Black Dahlia has defied this pattern. Elizabeth Short's murder, more than 75 years later, remains one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. The brutality of the killing guaranteed its initial infamy, but it is the legacy, the way the case has been mythologized, studied, and reinterpreted, that has kept it alive in public imagination. From the beginning, the Black Dahlia symbolized something larger than a single act of violence. To many, she represented the dark underbelly of Los Angeles, the contrast between glittering Hollywood dreams and the shadows in which those dreams died. Elizabeth Short came to embody the archetype of the tragic starlet, a young woman whose beauty and ambition made her both luminous and vulnerable. She was never a star, but in death, the world cast her in a role she never auditioned for: Hollywood's eternal ghost. The cultural legacy began almost immediately. Within months of the murder, pulp magazines and tabloids were running lurid retellings of the case, embellishing details, inventing dialogue, and exaggerating her relationships. The public couldn't look away, and neither could the creators who shaped American culture in the late 1940s and beyond. Crime novels took inspiration from her story. Noir films echoed her fate in fictionalized plots. Elizabeth Short became the muse of an entire genre fascinated by the intersection of beauty, death, and mystery. In literature, the case inspired James Ellroy's 1987 novel The Black Dahlia, a sprawling, fictionalized account of the murder. Ellroy, whose own mother was murdered when he was a child, poured his obsession with unsolved crimes into the book, weaving Elizabeth Short into a mythology of Los Angeles corruption and noir despair. The novel became a bestseller, adapted into a film in 2006, further cementing her place in American culture. Though fictional, these depictions blurred the line between reality and invention, ensuring that Elizabeth's story was never just hers, it belonged to the collective imagination. Her legacy also became entwined with the evolution of true crime as a genre. Before the Black Dahlia, crime reporting was often localized, confined to the immediate community. But her murder was different. It was national. Newspapers across the country covered it. Radio programs broadcast the grisly details. Magazines devoted entire spreads to speculation. In many ways, the Dahlia case pioneered the template for modern true crime fascination. A beautiful victim, an unsolved mystery, a city complicit in both the crime and the cover-up. Today's true crime podcasts and documentaries owe a debt to the sensational storytelling of 1947, and Elizabeth Short stands at the root of that cultural tree. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of her legacy is how she became an icon of something she never sought. Elizabeth wanted recognition, yes, but she dreamed of recognition as an actress, not as a corpse. Instead, she became famous for the brutality done to her. The press, Hollywood, and the public turned her into a character, mysterious, tragic, alluring, while erasing much of who she really was. Even today, when documentaries attempt to restore her humanity, it is difficult to separate Elizabeth Short from the Black Dahlia. The myth has consumed the person. The legacy also extends into Los Angeles itself. For decades, the city has lived with the shadow of the Black Dahlia. Tours still drive past Norton Avenue in Leimert Park, pointing to the lot where her body was found. Bars, museums, and even art galleries have staged exhibitions invoking her image. Amateur investigators pore over archives in search of overlooked clues, and every few years, a new book or film promises the definitive solution to the case. None ever succeed in solving it, but each adds another layer to her cultural immortality. Yet Elizabeth Short's legacy is not only about the mystery, it is also about what her story revealed, and continues to reveal, about society itself. Her death exposed the way women were treated in mid-century America, judged harshly for their choices, blamed for their vulnerability, objectified even in death. The press turned her into a caricature of femininity, oscillating between virgin and vamp, saint and sinner. That narrative continues to spark debates among scholars, feminists and historians, who see in the Black Dahlia a case study in misogyny, media exploitation, and the dangers women face in male-dominated spaces. At the same time, her story has become a lens through which people examine the mythology of Los Angeles. The City of Angels is also the City of Devils, a place where dreams soar and crash in equal measure. Elizabeth Short represents both sides of that coin. She arrived as a hopeful dreamer, anonymous among thousands. She left as a legend of despair, her body literally split in half, as if symbolizing the duality of the city itself. No wonder her story continues to resonate. Los Angeles has never stopped being the place where light and darkness meet. For her family, however, the legacy was much more painful. Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, lived to see her daughter's murder become a cultural fixation, but she never saw justice. Elizabeth's sisters spent their lives fielding questions, interviews, and the weight of a crime that refused to die. For them, the Black Dahlia was not myth but memory, a sister, a daughter, a wound that never healed. Their voices are often lost in the chorus of sensationalism, but they remind us that behind the legend was a real human being. Ultimately, the legacy of the Black Dahlia is one of paradox. She is both forgotten and unforgettable, erased as a person, yet immortal as a symbol. Her story has been told and retold in countless ways, each interpretation reflecting more about the teller than the truth. And perhaps that is the cruelest twist. Elizabeth Short wanted to be seen, to be known. In the end, she was, but not for who she truly was. The legacy remains unresolved, just like the case itself. Each generation rediscovers the Black Dahlia. Each finds in her story something that speaks to its own fears and obsessions. She is Hollywood's eternal spectre, the woman who never became a star yet became more famous than most who did. Her story lingers not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. 70+ years have passed since Elizabeth Short's body was discovered in that vacant lot in Leimert Park. Yet her story refuses to fade. The murder has become less of a police case, and more of a myth. One that haunts Los Angeles like a ghost that refuses to leave. It is whispered about on crime tours, dissected in books, dramatized on screen, and revisited in documentaries. Every retelling promises revelation, yet none deliver closure. The truth of the Black Dahlia remains hidden, locked somewhere between fact and fantasy. And in that space of uncertainty, the case has become Hollywood's darkest secret. The phrase Hollywood's darkest secret doesn't just refer to the brutality of the murder itself, though that would be enough. It also refers to the way the city has used Elizabeth Short, in life, as another dreamer chasing stardom, and in death, as the centerpiece of a legend it never stops retelling. Hollywood thrives on stories, and in Elizabeth, it found one that was inexhaustible. She became the archetype of the doomed ingenue, the beautiful outsider lured to the city of dreams, only to be consumed by it. The same industry she adored, the one she longed to be a part of, ultimately transformed her tragedy into spectacle. The secrecy also lies in what was never revealed. Despite thousands of pages of police reports, dozens of suspects and decades of speculation, the identity of her killer is still unknown. Each theory, no matter how compelling, falters under scrutiny. Evidence went missing. Witness statements conflicted. Leads were abandoned. Some believe police incompetence was to blame. Others suspect corruption, that the killer was protected because of his status, his wealth, or his connections. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a city riddled with backroom deals, payoffs, and compromised institutions. Was the Dahlia case simply too messy to solve, or was it never meant to be solved? That, too, has become part of the secret. The Black Dahlia has also come to symbolize the city's ability to exploit tragedy. Elizabeth Short was real, a daughter, a sister, a woman with fragile dreams. But to the world she became an image. Glamorous photographs in the paper, a name borrowed from a noir film, a symbol of beauty and horror intertwined. Her humanity was erased in favor of a legend that sold newspapers and inspired films. In that erasure lies another secret: how easily Hollywood, and the culture surrounding it, consumes women, turning their pain into entertainment. Yet, despite the exploitation, Elizabeth's story endures because it reveals something true. Los Angeles has always been a city of dualities. Light and shadow, promise and despair, the dream factory and the nightmare that follows. Elizabeth Short embodied that duality. She was both a hopeful young woman with ordinary struggles, and the tragic heroine of America's most famous unsolved murder. Her life was fragile, her death was grotesque, and together they created a story that continues to mirror the contradictions of the city itself. The allure of the Black Dahlia case also lies in its incompleteness. People are drawn to mysteries that resist resolution. Each time a new book, documentary, or theory emerges, audiences flock to it, not because they expect answers, but because they want to live inside the mystery. Elizabeth Short's murder has become a labyrinth, one where the search itself matters more than the solution. It has become, in essence, a noir story without an ending, forever looping back on itself, and that endlessness is part of what makes it Hollywood's darkest secret. For her family, however, the case was never about mystery. For her mother, Phoebe, and her sisters, the Black Dahlia was not a legend but a loss. They endured decades of sensationalism, watching as Elizabeth's name was twisted into something grotesque. To them, she was not a tragic icon or a noir archetype. She was Elizabeth, a daughter who laughed, a sister who dreamed, a woman whose life was cut short in ways too brutal to comprehend. Their grief was private, even as the world turned it into spectacle. That grief, too, remains part of the secret, hidden beneath layers of myth. So why does the Black Dahlia matter still? Perhaps because she forces us to confront the shadows beneath the lights. Hollywood sells dreams, but Elizabeth's story reminds us that the city's shadows are just as real, just as powerful. Her death exposed the fragility of those who come seeking fame, the dangers women face in worlds built on male power, and the hunger of a culture that feeds on tragedy. She matters because her story is not just hers. It is the story of every forgotten dreamer, every victim whose name did not make the papers, every woman whose life was consumed by a system that valued image over humanity. And so, the Black Dahlia endures. She endures in the whispered theories, the unsolved mystery, the endless retellings. She endures in the contradiction between who Elizabeth Short was and who she became in death. She endures because Los Angeles cannot let her go, and perhaps because she represents something the city would rather keep hidden. Hollywood is built on secrets. Some are glamorous, others are shameful, but among them all, none is darker, none more enduring than the fate of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, the girl who came to the City of Angels chasing light, only to become its most haunting shadow.